Hello and welcome to Professor Sandip Chakrabarti, who's the co-chair, if I'm not mistaken, of the Center for Transformation and Logistics, as well as the chair, Public Systems Group, IIM-Ahmedabad. Professor Chakrabarti, thank you so much for joining us. And today he's here in a special capacity. He's the author of a really well-researched paper on the financial sustainability of metro systems in India. And he's here to tell us exactly why we need to stop before we commission any more metros in this country. And if we have commissioned them, how do we end up making them sustainable? So, Professor, I'd like to start right away by asking you, we have how much? About 900 kilometers of metro rail in the country. We have many cities who have adopted it. But in most cases, it's not financially viable. How do we go about it? And why is it so important?
Thanks for the question, Kaveri. And, first of all, it's a pleasure to speak with you here. And it was fun to research and write the report for the Infravision Foundation. So it was a great opportunity. So to answer your question, if we actually step back, there are not many metro systems globally are financially viable the way that we define financial viability. And primarily the reason behind that is, metro systems as part of sustainable transportation, public transit in cities, they offer larger social benefits in terms of environmental, social, and other kinds of benefits that they offer. And therefore, using a simple, financial cost benefit may not tell us the full story about the feasibility, viability, or even the benefits of metro system. But having said that, it is true that most Indian systems, especially the smaller systems or the systems being developed in smaller cities that have not reached the level of network density that a city like Delhi has achieved. They are, if you just look at the numbers, they're possibly not doing too well in terms of the total total revenues they bring in from fare box as well as other kinds of non-fare revenues to the total total costs of the system or the expenditures for it. Why is this happening is something that we can continue discussing. How to solve this problem is the puzzle that we have been sort of working on. But just to start the conversation, it is, first of all, as you know, that do all cities need a metro? It's a big question. All cities may not need a metro. At some point they will. But again, we have embarked on this nationwide metro building initiative. So one question is that should we build, but the other is that, since we have started building, what can we do in order to make them financially viable? I think that's the story of my report, which is that now we have made the decisions. How can we move forward?
Absolutely, and you've suggested a very simple three-point formula. You've said you've got to set appropriate fares, you've got to boost non-fare revenues, and you have to promote ridership. So these are the three basic things, and then we'll discuss exactly how to improve the financial health. But let's talk about these three things first.
Sure. Again, if you actually look at it, why aren't we doing financially well financially? The first problem is that have these metro systems been able to reach or achieve their targeted or forecasted ridership? In most cases, the answer is no. We don't really need to get into the specifics here, but again, people or experts in the field, they're aware that metro systems aren't able to attract the number of riders or patrons that they expect or they should. So the question is, why so? The other problem is, if you see, are our cities or are our metros, or forget metro, even our public transit systems, are they competitive enough Have we created an environment where they're competitive enough? The fares being low is not the only factor that determines competitiveness. We also need to look at the alternatives. And that is where, all the alternatives, including private vehicle travel, people are fast adopting the two-wheeler modes and all of that. And that's because the alternatives are heavily subsidized. And we can talk more about why they're subsidized. But essentially, in a nutshell, the private cost, or the price that we pay for owning and operating a car or a two-wheeler doesn't necessarily reflect the social costs that their usage imposes on society and the environment, and that is a problem, and that is one reason why public transit is not being able to be competitive now, because it's just too attractive to continue to own and operate personal vehicles, and that's a big problem. And the third problem is that we have not been able to move towards a system where the beneficiaries of public transit pays, and that's where we talk about land value capture and all kinds of things, which is that the users of public transport are not the only ones that are benefited by public transport. There are a whole lot of other stakeholders, for example, through property value rises and other things, that they are benefited. But we don't have a systematic or a system of capturing that value that can be pooled and into developing, funding the system itself. And therefore, when we go to the three-pronged approach, yes, we need to think about how can we increase ridership of our metro systems. And ridership of metro systems cannot only happen by setting affordable fares only. We also need to look at the alternative. What needs to be done in appropriate pricing of the alternative modes, from congestion pricing to parking pricing, so that people are discouraged to use these less sustainable modes in a fair way. It's not that setting arbitrary sort of taxes on cars, but a fair taxes on cars and personal mobility, so that ridership increases. And also through other kinds of planning and design interventions. We keep talking about transit-oriented developments, right? Have we been able to do enough? The answer is not really. So we need to do that. The second pillar, as you mentioned, is setting appropriate fares. Our fare, I won't really comment on fare setting, but what is a problem is that many of our metro systems, metro fares are stuck way back in the past, and which basically means that with inflation and other kinds of cost increases, the real value of fares are getting eroded. And that is something that needs to change through institutional mechanisms that can keep us revising fares appropriately, so that the fare revenue, which will continue to be a small fraction of total revenues, but we need to still consider how to do it. And the third, as you mentioned, is thinking about other innovative mechanisms from I tend to advocate for thinking beyond just the user pays idea to a beneficiaries pay idea. And when we think about beneficiaries pay, that's when we will start thinking about that when we build a metro line, there are places surrounding station areas that naturally benefit from metro systems.
And the whole ecosystem that develops, food joints, all kinds of things, it becomes a whole viable ecosystem.
Absolutely. So, thinking about policy changes and how we can make those changes quickly and effectively to capture that value from, those that benefit from that area, as you said, through more retail activity, better designs, more connectivity, better regional accessibility. Those folks should be made to pay. In fact, we don't even know whether they, it's not that they don't want to pay. There is no system set up where they are able to contribute to the development of metro systems. And that's where we talk about betterment levies or, impact fees, air rights. And we recently have read that, some regional rail systems are actually leveraging this air rights development, which is to build on top of stations or on top of corridors, and leasing out or selling those spaces to earn revenues. And those can be substantial, revenues that can, dramatically improve the health of metro systems. So we are having a lot of these conversations in selected circles. But I think we need a system where we can, in a more cohesive manner, think about all of these routes towards financial system.
Right. And in fact, let's just briefly talk about the 5 points you've you mentioned about improving the financial health, so that we get a complete picture. And then we'll go on to the idea of AMTA 2.0, which I think is a very significant contribution of this paper. And it's something that can be done. So let's just briefly talk about the 5 points that you mentioned about improving the financial health.
Sure. So, if we, what I argue is that if we do, if we are committed to improving the financial health of metro rail systems, then we need to have certain goals. And these goals should be that we shouldn't be worried that metro rail systems need more public funds or more government intervention. In fact, what I've argued is that there needs to be more rather than less government intervention, creatively, meaningfully, in improving the financial health of metro system, which means systematically increasing more public funds using appropriate streams without hurting the economy. The other goal that we need to aim for is to select the most effective urban transportation mix in cities. Thinking about metro rail systems as a separate system that we can just connect to other systems and other networks won't do. We have to think about urban transportation systems as a whole and metro as an element in it. The other thing is, as you said, we need to promote transit ridership and think about transit orientation in our built environments and think about how we can do it. And we need to systematically attract private sector participation to the extent possible. And the extent possible is important because we shouldn't, two things. One is that when we talk about public-private partnerships in metro, so far the private parties are only engaging as contractors or service providers, right? I mean, they run the trains or operate, but we need more substantive private sector participation as investors, owners of systems, and that can only happen in certain highly profitable routes, and that's okay. We need to privatize those parts of the networks that are more attractive to the private sector, because we need to recognize that the private sector has certain demand. But the other thing also is that as governments become more responsible, they will probably create the contexts within which the private sector can continue. So, we talk about viability gap funding and all of that, and these are important to make projects attractive for the private sector. So, you're talking about the four, how to do this, right? I mean, one thing that I say is you have to bring the urban local bodies into the metro decision making, and that is something that is missing. And and in order to do that, you need to have urban local bodies as stakeholders in metro rail projects, metro rail systems, and you need to also work with them to activate innovative local level revenue streams, and that's where land value capture, congestion pricing, and all of those things come in. The second is we need to streamline the metro rail fare setting process. We need to streamline the metro rail fare periodic review process and revision process. And what kinds of institutions, systems will enable us to do that, we need to really think about that. The third thing we need to do is to increase the financial powers, but also the accountability of metro rail authorities. Often metro rail authorities may have great ideas involving land use planning and land use policy, but do they necessarily have the power or the jurisdiction to implement those changes? Often they have to rely on the state government in order to make those changes, and it takes time. It's often not possible. And therefore, we need to think about how metro rail authorities can be more powerful, but at the same time more accountable. And the fourth is, how do you think about strategically enhancing this private sector involvement and investment? And what I argue is that governments have a huge role to play. We can't just, private sector meaningful involvement as investors won't happen magically. Governments have to create those conditions, and those conditions will only happen when governments find robust streams of revenue, just streams of revenue that can be justifiably be used to for metro rail projects, because at the end of the day, when we have a center-state joint venture for the most part in metro rail, even if they don't perform well financially, there is the government to save the metro, right? I mean, that's true. However, do we want general funds or any kinds of funds to be used towards metro rail? Probably not. How can we make those beneficiaries pay? And what I argue is that if beneficiaries are made to pay, metro rail financial health can be turned around.
Right. And Professor, as you mentioned also that you need these authorities to be created, the AMTA 2.0 as you call them, and they can actually become a huge source of revenue for urban local bodies which are really starved for funds. I mean, that kind of revenue can replenish so many of our urban areas as well. So, it needs someone at the helm who has a cohesive view of the entire public transport system, the use of public spaces. I mean, it has to be almost like a visionary, and sometimes these, sometimes you get them, but sometimes you don't. I mean, these are not institutionalized, they're individual driven. So how do you institutionalize this kind of vision?
Sure. Again, without going into too much of details, we know that most cities, in fact, large cities, have numerous public, transportation agencies. I mean, some cities have more than 10, 12 agencies. There is one agency that operates the roads. There is another agency that runs buses. There is another agency that runs metro. In fact, often there are multiple agencies that run metro systems, right? And in order to and it has its own problems. If you think about the need for functional, technical, and institutional integration, that doesn't really necessarily happen. And we know from literature, from many case studies all over, that this kind of functional, technical, and institutional integration is absolutely necessary for not only operating transportation systems seamlessly and all of that, but also to ensure that they perform well and the right kinds of investments are done, right? Because otherwise, often we have certain priorities to invest in one system rather than the other, but again, that doesn't necessarily make overall transportation mobility and accessibility improve in a city. So the need for integration was well known, and from a very long time, in our country, we have been talking about the formation of unified metropolitan transportation authorities, or UMTAs as we call it. But what we know is that so far the idea of the UMTA was, and for good reason, to serve as some sort of a coordination body, right? A coordinated planner that actually solves the kind of problem that I was talking about. And that's great thinking. But what we do know is that the progress that we have made towards the establishment of UMTAs and the achievement of the kinds of goals that we are talking about, appropriate transportation, high levels of ridership, financial feasibility across modes, as well as moving towards sustainable transportation and all on our sustainable transportation path, that has not necessarily happened effectively, right? And what we are arguing here is that rather than thinking about how we can fix the earlier conception of an UMTA, why don't we leapfrog ahead and look at other cities, for example, London and the Los Angeleses of the world, can we start thinking about what we are calling the UMTA 2.0, which is essentially an integrated planner, owner, builder, operator, and policymaker of multimodal transportation system in cities? And can we just leapfrog and go there? It's going to be extremely hard. But then again, as a country, we're solving many hard problems now, right? And what we are arguing is that the institutional change may be hard, but the gains and the benefits out of this kind of an integrated structure are immense. And what we are talking about, one agency for metros, buses, LRTs, maybe ropeways, feeder systems, light rail transit, even private operators, how they are regulated and licensed, non-motorized transportation infrastructure. So one agency that does all of that, and one agency that also holds and houses what we are calling the urban unified metropolitan transportation fund, which should be the dedicated and the sole urban transport fund for capital expenditures as well as O&M expenditures of not one system but all systems together. And that is the architecture, institutional architecture that we are in.
Would it take a state law to do that? Would it take an amendment? What kind of change do we need to have something like this happen?
So it has to start at the center. And I think maybe the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs or somebody of that sort needs to take the lead in thinking about and crafting an UMTA policy, because many of the transportation infrastructures in our cities are not only state and local. Metros do not have local, but here we are not only talking about metro. And just to clarify, although we are starting, the idea is that how to make metros more financially sustainable. What we are arguing is that even to make metros financially sustainable, we need to think about this unified comprehensive system. But yeah, so to answer your question, it has to start from the center. And what we are here basically talking about is that the UMTA at the city level, maybe for all million plus cities, or maybe we can start with all cities that are million plus, or cities that have already started building metro rail systems, or are planned for or sanctioned metro rail systems. They should start. And the idea is that the UMTA has to, as you said, a visionary needs to head that UMTA, because the transportation vision, which is what is the sustainability goal of the city? What are our national, state, local priorities? What are our financial considerations? They should drive the multimodal transportation planning across modes. Who gets what? Where should I invest? Right? Who should be a donor mode and who should be a donee mode? And those kinds of, one mode can subsidize the other. All kinds of things need to be thought about. So there needs to be a visionary, but also the board of the UMTA needs to have representation definitely from central and state governments, but also what we argue is from the local government as well, because many of the implementation or even the sourcing of funds, local funds, and planning locally needs local presence, which is somewhat missing in metro rail planning these days. That needs to happen. And there could also be independent experts on the board, and a visionary should ideally lead this effort across all of those cities. And this UMTA should have not only transportation powers, but also jurisdictional fiscal powers to entrust to them.
Is there any city in India you think that's headed the right way?
Well, some cities have created UMTAs, right? They are thinking about, many cities have created UMTAs. You look at Bangalore or Mumbai, they're obviously thinking about UMTAs. Again, what we're saying is that that thinking of UMTA as a planning body is not enough. Let's move from there to this integrated ownership model. And the ownership model is not necessarily mean that we are going to have governments or public systems in transportation in the future. These bodies can also partner with private entities. And when we are talking about this urban unified transportation fund, what we are basically talking about is that fund, that integrated fund, will source from various streams. For example, there will be conventional streams such as fare box revenues across modes, operational non-fare revenues, external borrowings, private investment will flow into this unified fund, but also more innovative funding such as land value capture, congestion taxes, parking charges, carbon taxes, tax increment financing mechanisms, other kinds of local taxes will flow in. But in addition to that, as many other cities globally do, is that into this fund, there will be central and state allocations. And often this UMTA will enter into 3 or 5 years, or could enter into 3 or 5 years funding agreements with the center and state governments who are going to allocate money from many different sources, maybe from their general funds, loans and grants. There could be green funds that can be allocated. There could be any other transportation fund. But also what we are arguing is that the state and center money that flows into this urban transportation fund needs to be carefully, that mechanism also needs to be thought about. For example, should they only be formula based, or should they be competitive, where city A competes with city B to get a central or state money, or whether I would say whether that state and center funding should also be performance based, which also makes this AMTA more accountable. That my past performance would guide my future funding amount. And for that, maybe at the center level, we talked about the ministry, there potentially could be a independent standing committee who would actually evaluate all of these project proposals or funding requests from all of these AMTA. So we have in our report kind of laid out the very high level architecture that is intended to kickstart some constructive conversations.
Right. Would you say London is the ideal example of having an integrated public transportation system? Although even there, when they want to do something like ULEs, those taxes on cars, I mean, there was such a huge protest and against the mayor. So this is something that affects people so deeply, and it's so surprising that we don't have something like this in India on a broader level. But is there a city in the world that you could say that, this is really what we should look at and perhaps aim for?
I think you're right. I mean, if we think about at least the institutional arrangement and the functions that an AMTA type body should serve, the London or the Transport for London model could be some way to go. We could absolutely look at that model. In our report, we also talk about Los Angeles, and the reason we talk about Los Angeles is also because in many North American cities, they have this idea of local option sales tax measures, which is again and over and above any kinds of sales taxes that we pay. There is the idea that we pay a half a cent or whatever voter approved that goes into a dedicated transportation fund. So the importance of local revenue generation is well known, and many cities have started establishing those systems. But as you said, I totally agree with you. We can talk about congestion pricing, carbon taxes, fuel carbon taxes, or parking charges. Easier said than done. Absolutely. London, decades back, they started thinking about the congestion pricing zone, right? But gradually they implemented the ultra low emission zone on top of it. Does the public really support it? Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Our citizens support it. I don't know. I mean, I have a sense, and some of our studies show, very recent studies show that our public acceptability of congestion pricing kind of measures, and also I would say acceptability among planners is higher than what I expected. The only thing is
absolutely. Professor, for instance, look at the seamless rollout of CNG in a city like Delhi. After all, it was done, right? It's not that it has not been successful. So it's something that one should look at, that the public acceptance of measures such as those is not so poor in India.
Absolutely. And when we think about congestion taxes, for example, right? I mean, we found that public acceptability is higher, as I said, than what we expected. But there is a consistent demand among citizens or users of the road and also planners, which is that we cannot think about congestion pricing unless we have the alternatives right. Which is, do we have alternatives where people could shift? And that is where we need to get innovative. Just as an example. There are a lot of people stuck in traffic who are willing to pay a lot of money to get out of traffic, right? So can we start thinking about managed lanes or priced lanes, which we call, the high occupancy toll lanes? Can we start thinking about that? I think that absolutely it's a time to start talking about it, which is that there is a lot of people with a lot of willingness to pay to drive faster and enjoy a more reliable travel. And in fact, though that express lane money or a part of it can actually be used to subsidize or build alternative transportation systems. And in fact, the guarantee of future revenues from toll roads can actually help generate financing for alternative transportation systems. So we should absolutely start talking about it. And these kinds of models where one mode or one kind of travel subsidizes the other mode, other kinds of travel in a justifiable, equitable way. There are numerous models out there. It's just that, and there's tremendous potential in our cities, which can easily be activated if we start talking about it. And it's great that through this forum, through the Infravision Foundation's report and other such reports, we are able to bring at least these conversations into the policy, debate.
Of course, the opposite can happen, like the odd even in Delhi, where apparently it increased the ownership of private vehicles. That can happen as well. So you can't really predict public behavior as well, right?
That's right. And I would again, just me, but the kinds of prohibition seldom works, and I think we need to get into creative pricing mechanisms without hurting any party, and that is probably going to move us forward. The odd even didn't really fly, and I think there are reasons why it did not fly. And here we are actually talking about more carefully. We have to be more careful and potentially use pricing as a tool rather than regulation or prohibition to move forward. I would argue.
Yeah, I think prohibition doesn't work in any area at all. So thank you so much, Professor. It was so delightful to talk to you about this. And there's, of course, so much more to talk about, but we will do that again. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you very much for a most interesting paper that you've done for the Infravision Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.